Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Man, such a powerful, powerful story. It's like, do I even need to say anything now? Like, that is just enough right there, right? I have the privilege to not only follow that up, but to wrap up our Who's Next series with week 4. We've been asking uh, four, uh, four questions. 4 questions. Yes, I am the world's tallest goat jockey. I just realized what y'all are laughing at. I was like, wait a second. Yeah, that's me. Uh, I haven't officially sat on a goat yet. I was just saying, maybe once, maybe once. We're exploring Moses' story this week, this month actually, asking 4 questions. Who's next for hope? Who's next for healing? Who's next for leadership? And today we're going to cover who's next for purpose. So I got a question. Have you ever felt like you were handed a character that you're supposed to play that didn't quite match up with who you really are? Like, as if who you are wasn't enough and that your story didn't matter. And so you need to adopt something else and become someone else in order to find purpose or to find worth or to find meaning in life. Have you ever felt like that? Gosh, I have felt like that. I have wrestled with that. I think I continue to wrestle with that. And the really interesting thing about Moses is that Moses actually felt that as well. So just a story recap of where we're at. Moses, he has a great call placed upon his life when he is a small infant. He's saved from a mass killing of Hebrew babies and brought into the house of the king of Egypt while his people are enslaved by Egypt. And one day he's supposed to rise up and save his people. And yet there's this colossal failure in his past. When he grows up, he actually murders a man and he buries him in the sand, and the authorities find out and they issue a manhunt, and he goes on the run. He starts running for his life. He goes to the desert. He hides there, and he spends 40 years in the desert thinking, I'm done. I've failed too big. So he rebuilds himself a life, a career, a family out in the desert. And that's just the first 2 chapters of Exodus, really. I mean, it's like, holy cow, this story is rich already. So this washed up could have been ex-con turned shepherd in his old age who thinks God is done, he is done, and there's no purpose left to his life, is where chapter 3 picks up. Now that sounds intriguing to me, which is why I love the story of Moses. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3. If you want to follow along, we're going to start in verse 1. Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west end of the wilderness and came to the mountain of God called Horeb. The angel of God appeared to him in flames of fire blazing out of the middle of the bush, and he looked, and the bush was blazing away, but it did not burn up. Now let's pause right there, because I have a question. I've read this over and over again, and a question hit me recently that said, how long do you got to stare at something on fire before you realize it's not being consumed? Have you ever been around a bonfire at a campground? Or I heat with wood in my home, so I have to throw wood in a few times a day into the wood stove. How long do you got to sit at the bonfire before you realize, wait a second, that log is just not being consumed? How long do you got to sit there and stare at this and realize that this is what is going on? My guess is probably a little while, maybe a little less for some kind of dried shrub out in the desert, but still, you would have to just stop and stare and wonder, what's going on here? So Moses, the miracle here is not that this bush is on fire and not being consumed. The miracle is that Moses noticed it. The miracle is that Moses had stopped and reflected and was slow enough to come and say, you know what, something is going on here. I've always read this story and said, man, it took God 40 years to come back for Moses, who he abandoned out in the desert until he learned his lesson. What if it's not quite like that? What if the story is more like it took Moses 40 years to finally come to a place where he could hear God saying, your story still matters. You see that this shrub, this bush was not consumed. It could have been on fire the entire 40 years waiting for him to turn around and take notice. That's the miracle, is that he finally slowed down and asked the right questions about his life, and he could hear God speaking, saying, your story still matters. Unpause. Let's continue. Moses said, what's going on here? I can't believe this. Amazing. Why doesn't the bush burn up? God saw that he stopped to look. God called to him from out of that bush and said, Moses, Moses. He said, yes, here I am. God said, don't come any closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for you are standing on holy ground. There's 3 words out of that whole phrase that really stand out to me, because they're the biggest lie ever spoken by any human ever. Here I am. Hey, Moses, Moses, here I am. This is the biggest lie of all of Scripture, repeated over and over and over. It's the lie that we tell ourselves. It's the lie that we live. Here I am. The person I am presenting to you is who I really am. But God knew that it wasn't. God knew that Moses had adopted a fake character, living a fake story supported by all the thoughtless routines that kept him blind to the fact that when he said, here I am, it was actually a lie. Because this wasn't the real Moses that stood before God. This was who Moses presented himself to be. And so God says, I need you to take off your sandals. Have you ever been over someone's house for dinner and you've had a really hard day at work and you're like taking off your boots, you take them off, you put them aside, and you're like, Lord have mercy. Maybe I better put these things back on. Give me some Lysol or something, because this ain't pleasant. Why is it that this stinky, dirty, bare feet is more acceptable to step on holy ground than the covered, sandaled feet? There's one difference here. You see, God made Moses' feet. Moses made his sandals. See, God made Moses with a certain soul, a unique expression of humanity that has never existed before, a way of seeing the world, a way of thinking about the world, a way of acting within the world. And then one day failure hits, someone calls him out, and he says, this person that I am is insufficient, insignificant, unacceptable. And he runs off to the desert and he makes these coverings for who he really is, who God made him to be. And he says, I better cover that up, and lives out someone else's story, live out someone else's script that's been handed to me. So he makes these pre-approved stories in the form of sandals that he uses to cover who he really is. But God desires to meet with the original Moses, the Moses with bare feet, the Moses that God made, the Moses that can stand before God, not the tweaked version that Moses adopted or the Facebook profile Moses that he has so carefully crafted. Because God can see through all the cartoon-like caricatures that we create of ourselves, and he knows that they're not real. You remember when it says that out of the flames of fire, God speaks. My question was, like, that's kind of redundant, isn't it? Flames of fire. Is there another kind of flame? I've seen the fire-nados, those are cool, but they're still flames of fire. They're not going to be like flames of wind or there's no such thing as flames of ice or flames of cold or there's only one kind of flame that I know about, a flame of fire. So why is there this redundant flames and fire? You could say one or the other would be sufficient. So I looked into this, and it's actually a Jewish idiom, a saying, a picture, an illustration. Flames of fire means the intense vision of God, the gaze of God, the sight of God come down upon us, and we cannot step into this all-consuming fire and remain intact unless we come as we are. Because we can't bring our sandals, our man-made coverings, our human-made coverings, our false facades, our fabrications of ourselves, our Facebook profiles. We can't bring that before God and say, this is who I am, because God can see through all of that already. And this intense stare, this intense vision or gaze of God consumes all that is false. all that is fake, all that is fabricated, because it can see exactly what is, as is. And all that is true. The bush is true. God made it. It's not consumed. Moses is true. God made Moses. Moses won't be consumed. But these sandals, this fabrication, this false self, the fake personalities, they can't remain in the gaze of God and not be consumed. So God commands Moses to remove his shoes because they will light on fire. Because we cannot impress God with dramatic self-inflations that hide our ugly side. And the crazy thing is we don't need to, because we also can't suppress the love of God that is intensely burning in our direction at every second of every day. It just is. The love of God is so true and so constant and so pure. It just is. And to step into it means that we will encounter us as we are and God as God is. In verse 6, God speaks and he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. You see, when you come into contact with who you really are, you also come into contact with the fabrications that you have made, the glittering images that you have presented yourself to be. And the difference between the two can be so shocking that we can't handle it. The difference between the two makes us feel shame, makes us feel guilt that we are not living authentically. It feels like judgment, it feels like wrath, it feels like an apocalypse has descended and destroyed our whole world. Do you remember the time that you admitted you're an alcoholic? Do you remember the day that you finally realized that you're smothering a relationship with codependency? Do you remember the day that you jacked up your story so bad and wounded others in an attempt to keep your sandals on your feet? Yes, I remember that day in my life, and it hurts like hell, doesn't it? But the gaze of God, the intense stare of God, is a loving one. It reveals the false fabrications, yet the real you that God loves so much. And to have the courage to remain there without covering our face in shame is the task of every Christian. See, when Adam and Eve realized that they had jacked up their life in the garden, they made coverings and they hid when they heard God coming. When Moses realizes the same thing, he covers his face in shame. When Peter denies Jesus in the garden during the most intense time of Jesus' life, the trial and the crucifixion moment, he denies Jesus 3 times, and it says that Jesus and Peter lock eyes. He's caught in the gaze of Jesus, and Peter covers his face in shame and runs and hides. See, when we come into the contact with the raw versions of ourselves and the labels we created for ourselves and the labels that have been slapped all over us that we adopted for ourselves, we want to run and hide and cover our face like Moses did. But Moses stays. God never asked Moses to cover his face. God desired to talk to Moses face to face. So God says, go get my people and bring them back here to this mountain. Okay, insert the entire Prince of Egypt Disney cartoon here. Bam. Like that's just the big Exodus moment. Moses goes, talks to Pharaoh, let my people go. And then they cross the Red Sea. There's all the plagues before that. And then they get back to the mountain, chapter 19. We just jumped from 3 to 19, right? Because you all know the story in between. Or if you're not, go watch Prince of Egypt. It's awesome. So chapter 19 happens and Moses goes back up the mountain. Same place. Goes back up the mountain. And God says to Moses, get ready, I'm about to come to you in a thick cloud so that the people can listen in and trust you and completely when I speak to you. See, Moses climbs the mountain again, and this time he talks to God face to face. He does not cover his face. He has a long conversation with God from chapters 19 to chapter 34. It was a very long conversation. Very long. It's like lots of blueprints for like, this is how you build the tabernacle, and it's kind of a boring conversation. But that's kind of cool that God is sometimes boring. He's not so dramatic all the time. I like that part. So we're going to skip that long conversation. You all can read chapters 19 and 34 later. Chapter 34, Moses is done talking with God, face to face, no covering his face, face to face, comes back down the mountain. Chapter 34, verse 29 says this: When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, carrying the 2 tablets of the testimony, he didn't know that the skin of his face glowed because he'd been speaking with God. Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, saw his radiant face, and held back, afraid to get close to him. And when Moses finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. But when he went into the presence of God to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. Isn't this how it goes? Like, you have this transforming, life-changing encounter with God that changes the trajectory of your entire story. You realize your story matters. You realize your purpose. You realize God has placed you here for this thing here, to become this person here. And then the immediate reaction of people close to you is, covered that thing up. This is bright. This is intense. I can't handle it. They say that not because there's something wrong with your story. They say that because they're not ready to step into that loving stare, vision, and gaze of God and meet their own fabrications. And so we cover our face in front of them in shame sometimes. But I love what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. He says, whenever we turn to face God, just like Moses did, he's talking about this moment, God removes the veil, and there they are, face to face. They suddenly recognize that God is a living, personal presence, not a piece of chiseled stone. And when God is personally present, a living spirit, that old constricting religious legislation is recognized as obsolete. We're free of it, all of us. Nothing between us and God. Our faces shining with the brightness of his face. And so we are transfigured, much like the Messiah. Our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives, and we become like God. See, to believe that your story is not some random tragedy, not some misguided accident or a colossal screw-up. To believe that your story can be retranslated through the grace of God, and to find out that your story matters, that is a grace. That is to come down off the mountain with your face shining like the sun. Our last question. Imagine if Moses, standing before this shrub on fire, didn't cover his face, but he spoke to God face to face at that moment, and then went to Pharaoh with his face shining like the sun. Egypt worshiped the sun. Do you think that interaction could have been a little different? Do you think he would have had a little more authority with this person called Pharaoh? You see, the people with the boldness to stand in this fierce, loving gaze of God are the people who can stand before us and inspire hope and healing and purpose. Those are the people who can show us God in the midst of our stories. And then your story becomes a part of my story. And then our story becomes a part of Thrive's story. And Thrive's story becomes a part of God's story in all of human history, past, present, and future. But to hold back your story and to believe it doesn't matter is to rob all of creation, past, present, and future, of a unique piece of God's great story. See, your story matters. You wouldn't want to rob us of God's story in you. So today we invite you up the mountain to meet with God. The band's going to play 2 more songs, and you got a couple options. You can stay right where you are. You can reflect upon the songs and even join into worship with these songs. And you can stay there. Or you can come and take communion at the bottom of the stairs right here. Become a part of God's story. The story of God redeeming us through Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection, calling us home. And then over here we have your story. Communion is God's story. Over here is your story. You can come and write your purpose on this banner so you can know how to live your story. This mountain over here. People wrote a word, a single word, an action, a purpose. Maybe you need to come down and put it down on paper so that you have it there, your story. And then our story is over here, Thrive's story. Over here is a cross with broken pieces of pottery that we have used before. You can come and write your name on a stone and have it glued in there and say, you know what, I'm going to be a part of Thrive's story and where God is taking this church. God's story, your story, our story. It matters. So I'm going to pray, and then the band's going to sing 2 songs, and I'll release you to do any of those things. We also have prayer over here. If there's something broken in your story and you just feel like you need to talk to someone and get some perspective and to pray, we have a prayer team over here on the ramp on the way out. So let's pray and ask God to move amongst us. God, would you give us the courage to step into your loving vision and stare? Would you give us grace to set aside the life-denying, controlling, manipulating, fearful, defeatist, condemning stories that we tell about ourselves? Would you give us the boldness to embrace the freedom, the creativity, the hope, and the joy that comes with standing in the purifying gaze of your love? And God, finally, would you give us the voice to tell of this encounter without fear and without shame. In Jesus' name, amen.